Barry, thank you very much. I can't think of a better suited entree to today. It's a day where we're asking all of you as leaders to provide recommendations that will be instrumental, if followed and executed, to really improving the world that we all live in. So I really appreciate you setting us up for a wonderful day with that. What I'd like to do now is reintroduce Dalia Mogahed, our director, to come back up and lead the first panel of the morning for our public conversation.
Good morning once more. Can I please ask our panelists to join us on the stage? Rami Khouri, Essara Abdul Fattah, Mohamed Younis, and His Excellency Dr. Aref Ali Nayed. Because over the past year, the Middle East has seen tremendous change, probably more change than in the past 30 years. 4 Arab leaders have been forced from power in Tunis, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, while the uprising continues in Syria. For some, it's been relatively smooth in terms of the road to the first election. For others, that road to the first election was a bit more bumpy, but we're getting through it. And yet for others, it's been much, much more difficult. But where are we headed? What should our priorities be in the transitional phase? And most importantly, how do we build democratic societies on the rubbles of despotic regimes? Here to discuss these transformations with us are, I think, some of the leading thinkers on these topics. First, Rami Khouri, the director of the Assam Ferris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, and also someone who's been writing and thinking and speaking about these topics for years. Essara Abdul Fattah is a longtime Egyptian labor and human rights activist and one of the people who inspired the beginnings of the April 6th youth movement, which helped fuel the mass protests that brought down President Hosni Mubarak. I was very proud when I saw that Essara was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize this year. Mr. Mohamed Younis, my colleague, senior analyst at the Abu Dhabi GALLUP Center, who has written extensively on the Arab awakening, specifically focusing on Egypt and Tunisia. And His Excellency, Dr. Aref Ali Nayed, the Libyan ambassador of the United Arab Emirates, I'm sorry. He's often called a Renaissance man for his deep knowledge of Islamic sciences as well as Western philosophy. He brings this refined awareness to now the difficult world of political leadership in a very challenging environment. I'd like to start the discussion by turning to Rami to give us his thoughts on the big picture. What's going on in this region? What are we witnessing?
Thank you, Dalia. Thank you for having me on this panel. And it's an honor and a pleasure to do this and share some thoughts with you. I really think that we're witnessing the most historic moment in the modern history of the Arab world. In fact, what we're witnessing, I think, is the birth of the modern Arab world. What happened in the period between 1914 and 1922 was a kind of a false birth. What we're witnessing now is the true birth of the Arab world. And like all births, it's difficult, it takes time. And I would point out a couple of just key points. First of all, this transition from humiliation to legitimacy, which is, I think, the overarching transition that our societies are making, both as individuals and as societies, from humiliation to legitimacy, takes a long time. And the transition from authoritarianism to democracy also takes a long time. It took the United States and Western Europe approximately 2 centuries to give women the vote and black people the vote and to end discriminatory racist policies against minorities and Jews and blacks and other people. It took almost 2 centuries in Europe and North America.
And the struggle continues. And the struggle continues.
And the struggle continues. Gay people are now getting their rights and other people are getting their rights. But This is a long-term process. So we've done it for about 7 to 10 months now in the region, and it's still going on. I think the key critical issues that I would point out that are going on is that, first of all, we're seeing the birth of the Arab citizen, an individual who feels that he or she has rights and who feels that he or she is able to actually engage in society and bring about change. The individual citizen who has rights and power. Second thing we're seeing is the birth of the citizenry, the collective group of citizens who together put into action the principle of the consent of the governed, that the citizenry as a group have the ability to provide legitimacy to the political order and the social and economic order. The third thing we're seeing, I think, is the birth of politics, the peaceful contestation of power in the polis, in the city. And you see it on the street, you see it in election, you see it in the media, you see it everywhere. The birth of politics is starting to happen across the region. The fourth thing is you're seeing is the beginning of a process of credible accountability, again, through different vehicles. And the critical center of gravity of that process of accountability is the struggle for a realistic balance between civilian and military power. And you see this most dramatically in Cairo today. And it's going on every day. You see it between the military and the civilians and the elected officials and the people in the street. It's a heroic process. It's an epic process. We saw it in Turkey over the last 30 years. We're seeing it in the Arab world now, day by day, the civilian-military balance. And the cumulative impact of all of these issues, ultimately, I think what we're seeing is the emergence of two critical elements that have long been absent from the modern Arab world: the concept of national self-determination and the concept of real sovereignty. Sovereignty anchored in the rights of citizens, in a political process that is based on the consent of the governed and accountability, and that actually reflects the wishes of the majority and protects the rights of the minority. I think that those are the key points that I would mention. And just one last sentence, that the three critical elements that we see everywhere across the region, in every single country where there's been an uprising, and in others where there's been low intensity, petitions to the king or requests to the great leader or challenges to the mukhabarat and the police forces, in every single country in the Arab world, we're seeing three things: the demand for citizenship rights, which is why I call this a citizen revolt. The term I prefer is we're seeing a citizen revolt across the region. Citizen rights, a constitutional reform, and the demand for social justice. Those three things, citizen rights, constitutional reform, and social justice, for me, encapsulate the substantive importance of the transformation that's going on.
That was a perfect way to start us off. I think building on that, what I was really struck by is that all of these issues seem to have come later than they should have. To talk about the priorities of this phase, though, what are we hearing from people on the streets? Mohamed, what do people expect and need right now? I mean, I was very struck by what Barry just said about the needs of followers.
Yeah.
And where they're looking to.
Yeah.
What are we hearing from our survey research on what people are looking for right now?
Well, a lot of the data that we have gathered after governments have been overthrown, particularly in Tunisia and Egypt, very closely tie into those four things that Barry mentioned. On what followers are looking for. Trust is a huge issue now in many of these countries. In terms of the governments themselves, and as we mentioned yesterday, the underlying causes of many of these uprisings, dignity, perceptions of corruption in government and business, economic troubles, perceptions on all of those measures have stayed the same, if not worsened, in Tunisia and Egypt after the overthrow. So when we ask Tunisians, is corruption widespread in business? Is it widespread in government? They are as likely now, if not more likely, to say, yes, in fact, it is. despite the fact that Ben Ali has been overthrown and now the country is obviously very much in fifth gear in its transition process. But to really sum it up, Dalia, all of the underlying issues really emanate from the lack of one concept, and it's two words: transitional justice. And I mean that in the legal term of art. And for those of you who may not be familiar, transitional justice is the legal term that's used in order to acknowledge and also deal with crimes against humanity, economic grievances, anything that you can imagine, really, can be addressed through a concept of transitional justice. And why is transitional justice needed? It's needed in environments where the traditional institutions for rule of law either have evaporated, a government has been completely overthrown, or a regime has been overthrown, and there's not a sentiment that there is real commitment on the part of traditional rule of law institutions, law and order institutions, to enforce the rule of law, but also to maintain security. So just this morning, sitting up in my room, I kind of just drew a little map just to drive the idea home. So many of the challenges of these transitioning periods relate around security. And I'm just going to take the concept of vigilante justice, the notion that people themselves will attempt to right the wrongs or right crimes instead of the state coming in, instead of judges, courts, and the criminal justice process coming in to take care of them. So let's take vigilante justice. What we saw in Egypt very soon after the police and Mabahas Amn al-Dawla and security forces basically disappeared from Egyptian streets, we saw attacks on police stations, on local police stations. Some of these were opportunist individuals who were looking to steal weapons, etc., but many of them were individuals who were frustrated with the state, frustrated with experiences they've had with police in police stations, and many of them were people from neighborhoods that attacked their local police station. So what did this cause? This caused a perception, first of all, of a lack of security on the part of Egyptians, and we saw a spike in Egyptians saying, for example, that they didn't feel safe walking alone at night in their neighborhood, despite the fact that we didn't see a huge jump in actual reported instances of crime. But that perception or vacuum of security leads to foreign investors not being interested in continuing their investments in the country. It hits sectors like tourism, where people are now not as interested in going to countries where the situation is unstable. That situation leads to economic stagnation. That economic stagnation hits the masses the most, and especially people who live some sort of day-to-day earnings. That frustration then leads to disillusionment with the actual transition process and the revolution. That disillusionment leads to a lack of political cohesion and a lack of social cohesion, which leads to more instability. So it's really a cycle. The inability of the traditional institutions within a state to deal with criminal matters, to deal with allegations of corruption, to deal with economic crimes, disables a government, any transitioning government, to maintain the good faith on the part of the masses that are now in a transitioning period, in somewhat of a power vacuum, to keep faith that the wrongs of yesterday will not only be documented, but acted upon in the new Egypt, in the new Tunisia. Many of the challenges that we're seeing in some of these countries, it really comes down to whether or not you believe that the revolution is still alive. I mean, in Egypt, this is the conversation now. Is this revolution 2? Is it revolution 1? Is SCAF really going to give up power? Maybe they're just telling us they will. But all of this distrust really emanates from a sense on the part of people that the basic causes of what started these movements are not necessarily being addressed in a systemic way that makes people feel that there is a process through which they can go and take their grievances. Another thing that we saw erupt in Egypt was these factional protests, people demanding increases in wages, people saying that they were wronged in terms of their wages, and someone else got a promotion that they were supposed to get. So we also need a sort of a fact-finding mission, specifically, I would say, on corruption. What we did see, unfortunately, in Egypt, are really politically motivated trials. So people would protest in Tahrir, and then the next day, Ahmada is facing allegations of corruption. What ended up happening is that in many cases, the evidence really wasn't strong, and some people with very bad reputations have now been acquitted. And that creates a lot of distrust and a lot of frustration. Another option would be, and Tunisia actually has started to do this, is to have a neutral non-criminal, non-judicial fact-finding mission on the biggest players, the biggest sectors, and the largest companies and instances of corruption. Doing that actually brings out all of the evidence of these allegations. And from there, you can then begin to criminally try individuals in an environment where evidence has actually been developed in cases, so that you're not bringing people to trial, like Ahmed Aiz and others, who then get an acquittal, and then now everybody thinks that there's a conspiracy. Well, the lawyers in the room know that a lot of times acquittals are not based on conspiracy, they're just based on the fact that there's not enough evidence to bring somebody to trial. So in 2 words, I would say transitional justice has been the major miss of the Arab Spring.
I think you've hit on a very important point. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Aref, who I think is one of the best people probably alive to talk about transitional justice, and someone who's working directly on this topic. Now, you come to this work not from a political background, but from a background as a scholar and with a spiritual tradition. What principles do you bring, and would you advise one to have in this process of transitional justice, especially in a place as challenging as Libya?
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah. First of all your judgments are skewed because you are a friend, so nobody should listen to all the great things you've said.
Example of biased judgment.
Yeah, biased.
Biased judgment. And the second thing I would like to say is that while I agree with Sayyid Muhammad regarding the importance of transitional justice, I think it's very important that transitional justice does not get considered only in light of the literature on transitional justice that has come mainly from Western institutions, given their experiences in other countries. And that transitional justice must try to link up with the spiritual and religious and tribal and social heritage of each country. And each context is very different. So transitional justice in Egypt, with its very long history of juridical tradition and great professors and jurists like Sanhouri, who even wrote the Libyan, good chunk of Libyan laws, is one thing. In Tunisia, with their own jurists and the tradition of Zaytuna and so on, etc. And in Libya, again, we're a little bit more tribal, a little bit less cosmopolitan historically, and where Sufi orders like the Sanusiya played a very strong role in building up certain spiritual resources in the country. It is extremely important to bear in mind these other elements in developing notions of transitional justice. And one of the things that we've been working on, very preliminary work, and hence my great interest in the work of Sheikh bin Bayyah, because he's an expert in an area of jurisprudence which is called Maqasid al-Sharia, which is the kind of a tradition that looks at the spirituality or the spirit of the law, the intentionality of the law, the philosophy of law, if you want, kind of similar to Montesquieu and on the spirit of the laws, where you're not literal and you're not narrow-mindedly looking at just rules, but looking at the intentionality of the whole thing. And interestingly, in tradition, and this is an Andalusian and North African phenomenon, Maliki approach to this, where certain things or values have to be preserved through Sharia, through the law, through any rule of law that we would like to develop. And these include life. We have to preserve life. We have to preserve property. We have to preserve faith. We have to preserve mind or intellect. And we have to preserve honor. And if you look at what has happened in Libya over the last 42 years or so, you will find that in all of these areas there's been destruction. There is actually an old joke now, but it is said that when Mohamed Barad'i visited Libya to do an inspection for the atomic, what do you call it, agency, energy, yeah. He wrote a report on Libya, it is said, this is a joke, this is not real, consisting of 2 lines. After the inspection he wrote, weapons of mass destruction, none. Mass destruction, plenty. Meaning Gaddafi actually did do mass destruction in Libya, and he destroyed the fabric of society and the values of society on all 5 levels. He destroyed life through killings and torture and imprisonment. He destroyed property by confiscations, complete confiscations of private property in 78, the burning down of the land registry, okay? And because of this, all property issues are so messed up in Libya. He destroyed mines by destroying the universities and hanging students in the university. He destroyed faith by destroying, he closed down the Dar al-Iftah. He closed down anything to do with jurisprudence, religious institutions, Sufi orders. He burned the books, he burned libraries, he destroyed the Jahboub, great center of learning. And he destroyed honor by not only resorting to rape as a weapon during this last war, but systematically dishonoring people. He actually used dishonor to control his officials and his followers and so on. So what you have is a country that is in great need of healing. And it is very important to not limit transitional justice to legalistic thinking. It is very important to think of it in therapeutic terms and healing terms, and to understand that it has to work at multiple levels. Now, Libya is a very rich country in resources, and these resources are not only the oil and the gas. There are massive spiritual resources. It is a country of poets, of very ancient tribal customs that do have conflict resolution mechanisms and institutions. It is rich with a Sufi tradition that emphasizes forgiveness and compassion. It has great jurists and fuqaha who unfortunately have been living in isolation and thinking in isolation, who now need to get together. So key to transitional justice in Libya is tapping again into these fonts of wisdom. And thanks be to Allah, we are already seeing this happen. We've had, this week actually, we're having another national reconciliation major conference in Tripoli. But just last week, there was a major conference with the tribal elders, whereby tribes from the east, the south, and the west met and are trying to use tribal-based conflict resolution resources to work on improving the situation between conflicting tribes, for example. Also, our religious scholars have been again and again meeting. First of all, they started meeting amongst their own cliques, meaning the Sufis were meeting by themselves, the Salafis were meeting by themselves, the Ikhwanis were meeting by themselves, the jurists were meeting. And now, this week, there is a big conference where they're all meeting together, inshallah. So there is more and more conversation. We've always seen the phenomenon of bridge builders between these various religious groups. And women have also been meeting. They've had very successful series of conferences and are now meeting with other organizations. So civil society is being reactivated. And what's really nice is that we're not importing models from outside. We are reading heavily. We've read much of the literature on transitional justice that comes out of specialized institutions, be they British or American or UN or European. And so we are learning. We know that we don't know, and we are learning. But we are also trying to make sure that this is an authentically Libyan process, and that no generalization is made onto Libya from even our neighbors. One of the things that I've warned about in yesterday's sessions, the work groups, was the notion that there is one single Arab Spring, and that there is one single trend in every country. I believe that many trends are country-specific. There are multiple springs, and these springs are partial, and there are pockets of autumns and summers and within the springs. And it is extremely important not to think that there is a single narrative that can encompass the whole story of what is happening. There are multiple narratives. There is polyphony, to put it in Mikhail Bakhtin's terminology. There is no one voice. There is no one line. And it's very complex. And I find it very useful to think of what is happening in Libya, even just Libya, in terms of complexity theory and phenomena of emergence, phenomena of flocking, and phenomena of networks or networks of networks. There is no single command and control center in all that is happening. And some people are freaking out. They say, hey, without single command and control, we're going to have chaos. But interestingly, we're having stability in Libya, almost miraculously. And people are saying, this is weird, this shouldn't be so stable, but it is stable. And the reason for the stability is the massive parallel nature of this. meaning that no one controls everything. And that is a good thing. It's not such a bad thing. Even with weapons, you know, people who are saying that it's very bad that weapons are widely spread. Yes, it is bad, but it's not as bad as weapons being monopolized by Gaddafi only. And with the fact that people know that the other person has weapons means that they are more careful in attacking another tribe or another. So I'm sorry for taking so long, but just to summarize, transitional justice is incredibly important, as Mohammed rightly says, and we are seeing these phenomena that the professor was pointing to, citizens and citizenry, but it's happening in different ways. A Libyan citizen is also a tribal creature. He's also a religious creature. So the idea of a Jeffersonian Enlightenment citizen is not quite applicable. So even when we say citizens, we have to be careful to make sure that it is. So yes, transitional justice is happening, but it will happen in a healthy way, in a healing way, if it is a lot more complex than just jurisprudence, and if it taps into the authentic traditions of the country. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the point about the importance of indigenous solutions and the differences between countries is extremely important and opens the question about the role of foreign actors. And I'd like to turn now to Essara to ask you about that. We know from our research that more than 80% of Egyptians oppose US funding to Egyptian political groups. Your organization that you're affiliated to or known to be affiliated to, the April 6th Youth Movement, has struggled with these issues around being accused of foreign funding. How do activists deal with their relationship with foreign funding? And most importantly, if we look around and address the American and European policymakers in the room, what would you say to them? How can they be more helpful than harmful in this process?
First, I agree with this. About 80% from Egyptians refuses the financial aid from US. It's a fact, and it's related to many reasons, especially the days of Mubarak and the support for the US strategy to Mubarak within the days of revolution. Egyptians cannot forget the statement of Hillary Clinton to say that is, we trust that Mubarak will keep Egyptian stability. These sentences was during the days of revolution, when we are in the days of struggle, when we are killing in the streets, and they come to the TV and say we trust Mubarak. And this is the continue of here or the US support for Mubarak during the years of Mubarak regime. And now also after this revolution, they continue. I think they cannot understand the lesson that we should have a balance between dealing with individuals or leaders and dealing with people. You should support democratic principles, not people. But they continue now to support the military, to support the Tantawi, to support al-Mushir until now and the military council. And also they cannot understand the lesson with others countries, as in Yemen. They cannot support now the people in Yemen and to try to take support for the people there against Ali Abdullah Saleh. All these things affected badly for Egyptians to refuse the US aids. Also, because of this strategy, they cannot trust their support for democracy. How they can support democracy and support Mubarak for years. And now we said that is we are going to support democratic values and support people. So it is a conflict in their words. And after revolution, Egyptians, they have more trust in themselves. They found that is they have the ability to build their own country. They refuse, they feel that is we can have political independence now after the revolution. So their feeling is more increased after the revolution. Sure, this is affect, especially the last thing, maybe the foreign policy of American towards Israel and Palestine. I think it's main factor for Egyptians when they found they support Israel and they take decisions against Palestine, especially after the last decision about stopping or preventing the aid for UNESCO after the admit of Palestine as a member in it. This decision was affected even not only the citizens, but also the civil society organization who dealing with the US organization. They take some decision to support, cooperate with US governmental organization like NDI and IRI. They said we cannot working with governmental US organization, and we will work with another civil society organization, US civil society, or even for European organization more than US, because the European attitude is more better than the US. So they transfer their working or their partnership from the US organization to Arabian embassies, especially Arabian embassies offer more proposals for partnership with civil society with more easy process and procedures than of the US. And all this affect the work of the civil society. Now the individuals, the normal individuals, citizens who has no political background before, refuses to participate in the activities and in the events make with partnership with some Egyptian organization and with US organization. When they found the banner USAID or another, they refuse to come. And even if they know before, they refuse to come. If they come and see this banner, they refuse to continue and say, no, I cannot continue. So all these affect badly, yeah, civil society, and they leave. They leave the conference from, when they found this, they leave the conference, sorry, I cannot participate. And all this makes the civil society decision stop to dealing with US organization and try to, when you find any Arabian slogan, they not have any minds. They continue in participation.
Dalia, can I actually react to that?
Yeah.
I just want to clarify, because you did mention the sentiment on USA to political organizations. And a lot of people could conclude that that's an anti-American sentiment sort of, bubbling up, and now in a free Egypt, and in a world where U.S. foreign policy is not a very popular thing in Egypt or in the region, quite frankly, that's really the reason. But what we also found are that the people who see the U.S. as a political model for Egypt's transition are even more staunchly against U.S. aid to political groups.
Yeah.
And
I agree with you that the aid shouldn't come to the political parties. It should come to the civil society who deal directly with political parties.
Exactly, and I think that if you ask the average American how they feel about China funding the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, I mean, I think that the sentiment would be just as prevalently against that kind of influence. But I think that we also need to keep in mind, that states are political actors. And no matter what part of the world you're from, if you're pouring money into a situation, you're pouring money into it for a reason. And I think in countries where transition is occurring now, a danger is to think that as long as it's not Western, it's safe. And I think that that's a very, very bad assumption to make, because it doesn't pan out in political history as we know it. States are acting based on their interests. That doesn't make them bad actors, but it makes them actors with interests, and those interests need to constantly be looked to from folks that are receiving aid.
I mean, that's exactly true. It's very interesting that when we do look at our research, Egyptians are welcoming of Arab government aid, somewhat welcoming of IMF aid, and very unwelcoming of American aid, in that order.
And also, there is something happened nowadays is how the military council try to destroy the image of all the activists who are working in the civil society, who are working with the civil society. They said they are agents, they are trying to build or to work in the civil society to have money in indirect ways. And just yesterday, Sami Anan declared that he will start after the elections an investigation for all the activists who are working in civil society. All these things make the people have some fear to work with civil society.
Well, the struggle here, of course, and I just want to talk about this a bit longer, is that American and European, and in some cases Arab governments, but especially American and European governments, are working on funds to support democracy and the Arab Spring. So there is money being put aside for these things. There are people being hired. There are projects that are being organized. What advice would you give these policymakers? Some of them are in the room, all of you. What would you say to them to advise them, to guide them on that work? I'm going to start with Dr. Aref.
It's a very important and difficult question to address, because I think it's a very complex situation. I think rather than think of it as governments, particular governments giving particular aid or agencies giving particular kinds of support, I think we need to think of the issue of funding of political activity in general as a major issue. And I believe that one of the most fundamental things that everyone should be doing is total transparency, declaration of everything. But I would hate for this to be limited to only such institutions as you were mentioning, because there is a lot of money that is coming into the region and that's trying to play a part in the political situation. And I am sure there are many ways of dividing or having typologies of this money, but I think it is important to at least begin with a preliminary typology. At least I'll speak of my own country. There is the money that you're mentioning, so that there are some US agencies and institutions and UK agencies and institutions and European agencies and institutions who are trying to set funds for democracy building or for media development or for whatever. So there is that category. Then there is multinational kind of aid and support, so be it the IMF or the World Bank or the UN, and these are like multinational institutions. But there is also regional aid that's coming from particular countries, especially Gulf countries. And I won't mention specific countries, but there's definitely some considerable aid coming, okay? Which has to also be considered. It's not just US money or UK that has to be considered. Fourthly, which is extremely important, because Libya is a rich country, despite the fact that the richness did not reach the people, but it is a rich country. And over the last 10 years or so, around Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, around Abdullah Sanusi, around people like that, the other children of Gaddafi, there developed circles of wealth, okay? Of huge wealth, roughly in the billions and sometimes in the hundreds of millions, concentrated in very few hands. And these individuals have circles of followers, so you get another circle of tens of millions, and then you get another circles of a couple of millions, and then you get another circle of hundreds of thousands. We are seeing in Libya the phenomenon of this money coming in now. And some of these individuals who have this vast wealth are the prime suspects in corruption charges. What is interesting is some of them did aid the revolution as it was happening. So as they got rid of their masters, so for example, you'd find the partner of Abdullah Sanusi. Abdullah Sanusi is no longer, but his partner is still active and helped the revolution, and may now own newspapers or media, and may now even support even religious scholars or tribal scholars who will bless his work. So what I'm trying to say is the problematic of funding has to be addressed at the global level, Western, regional, and local. And in my view, when you look at the numbers, in terms of at least the regional and the local, are massively more than anything that has been coming from anything international or multinational. So I think it's simplistic to just reduce it to American aid or to UK aid. You need to look at having a fair playing field for everyone. Now we only have 6 more months for elections, and people who have money now have a distinct advantage. And people have money and organizational skills, either by buying organizational skills from outside or being part of transnational parties that have a history of organizational skills have a distinct advantage. I believe that if we are going to develop true democracies, we need to level this playing field. And number one thing, very important, is for everybody to declare what money they're bringing in, what are the sources, who's giving what, to whom, and secondly, to give access to everybody, to all young people, to organizational skills and training across the board so that it's not unfairly given to one segment versus the other. I'm sorry for taking so long, but yeah.
Transparency and a level playing field. Rami, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that a couple of points. There really are two major issues here. One is the issue of, which has been raised, I think, by Aref and others, is the issue of consistency. You know, if we're trying to create credible, legitimate, decent governance systems in our country, we need a level of transparency and consistency that isn't there now yet in most of our region. And so we have to look at the aid coming into these countries from all over the place. You have a lot of money from the Gulf, or Saudi Arabia especially, to different groups. In the Levant, where I live, you have Iranian funding, political involvement in many groups in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. And you have, so there's all kinds of money from the region coming in with a very direct political, ideological influence, which is perfectly okay if the system is open to everybody. So I think we have to be much wider in our level of analysis, and the ability of these systems to deal with those external influences is going to depend on the strength and the quality of the foundation of legitimate, pluralistic governance that we develop. And this is where the issue comes in of exactly the point that Aref raised, which is the cultural element, the religious, the tribal, the social, the professional groups. There's all kinds of groups in society now that for the first time can operate openly and engage with one another. And I repeat, it took the West 200 years to come to a situation of relatively stable but equitable democratic governance. These things take a long time. It's going to be very bumpy, and there's going to be all kinds of distortions going back and forth. And the only antidote to that is a mechanism of some kind of internal indigenous accountability that can deal with these distortions and let the process keep moving forward. The second point I'd make is I think we have to overcome our obsession with the United States. The fascinating thing that's going on, I mentioned one of the points I said that we're experiencing, I believe, is the beginning of a process of real sovereignty. In other words, this is the last decolonization battle in the Arab world, which I think we're witnessing now. We did have one decolonization battle which we won, which was the digital decolonization represented by Jazeera and other Arab satellite channels. That was the first decolonization that truly happened in the Arab world, where we took on Western institutions in their own game and beat them and did better than them in reporting. And I would argue that Jazeera is better than most of the Western channels in terms of covering global news, especially covering this area, even covering Arab-Israeli issues. So we've won one decolonization battle. Now the big one comes, which is decolonization of national sovereignty. And part of this is mental decolonization. We've got to overcome this obsession with the United States. It's hard to do. The Americans are not very good at colonialism. They haven't done it very long. They're not very good at it, and they don't know how to actually get out of the process. They're leaving Iraq and they're leaving Afghanistan, but they're not really leaving the whole business of power. And I think one of the things that we need to demand is that it's not enough for Condoleezza Rice simply to say we had 60 years of supporting security and not democracy, we made a mistake. That's not enough. I think what we need is some kind of a real contrition and even an apology of some sort, that this wasn't just a mistake, that this was actually verging on not quite criminality, but something close to that, that this was really destructive. And we're seeing the consequences of that destruction now. All kinds of tension and turmoil and extremist movements and violence over the last 30, 40 years. So I think we've got to grapple with this issue of Western American aid in a bigger frame, but also drawing on these incredible wells, these deep well springs of mercy and tolerance and forgiveness and justice that are the foundation of culture in this region, whether it's religious culture or tribal culture or ethnic culture that define this part of the world. So I think it's, this is an issue that hasn't really come up because people are just busy still taking control of their lives and dealing with the immediate issues of jobs and security. But in the longer run, I think this is going to be the big battle, which again, I think we can win that battle in this region because we have in our ethical, religious, cultural, social traditions, we have those assets that will allow us to engage the Western world and find that middle ground that brings both justice and stability, but also a platform for engaging the West on a more equitable basis.
No, one thing Rami said is really two things. One is the importance of developing that mental and cultural and political sovereignty. But you also said that it's fine to have this foreign funding as long as it's open and available to all. Can we really have heavy foreign funding from Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United States into these new fragile democracies and still stay independent? That's a question I'd like to have. What should the rules be? How should funding work? What should it fund? What should it be invested in? The money will be invested somehow. What would we give as advice? What should it be poured into?
I think in this critical time in the Arab world, it should be direct for the people. It should invest in some projects. The people feel this project affects their lives directly. I think now the economic troubles are the most important issues in most of Arab worlds. If they found that this money invested in project affects their life directly, like housing problem, like healthy care, like transportation, which is the main problem now in Egypt, which affect them directly in their life. I think now also how we can get new business, which helps to have new jobs for the youth. I think these 3 or 4 problems which affected people directly, and also maybe they can change the mentality of the citizens toward the U.S. policy. But the most important thing, I think they should make the political transitional aside now. I think the Arab worlds can do their political transitional by their way. I think it's so wrong from the ambassador in Egypt to say for the election committee that we can help to fund money for your election process. It's so wrong offer from here in this time, for the time of election, to offer money for election process. But they can make money for another things which not directly to the political transition.
So economic development, investment, job creation, not democratic.
At this time, not democratic.
Not right now.
Yeah.
Not democratic state building.
Yeah, that's a great point. If I just may add something. I do believe that when money is given, it has to go to the people, and it's very important to make sure that there is even distribution of the benefits of whatever is happening. But I've noticed also an interesting phenomenon, perhaps because I am into networking and building networks, physical networks, as in information technology networks. I've come to appreciate the importance of routers. And what I've noticed about funding is that there are always pass-through routers. And that these routers gain a certain power over people because they become the dispensers of benefits. I've noticed it in when we were fighting this war, in the routers of weapons, for example. Whoever, for example, if a country wants to give weapons to the revolutionaries, whoever routed those weapons or was seen as the man who brought the weapons to the tribes who fought or to the groups that fought, gained a lot of power, even though he had zero money, he had zero resources. But the very fact that he was the router gave him leverage. And now that the war is over, alhamdulillah, we have total liberation, this is now becoming money routing. So whoever now is able to dispense money to the young fighters in the katibas is able to exercise a lot of power because he is the router of the money. And this is extremely dangerous because it's creating inadvertently warlords and also peace lords through the routing. It's extremely important that if aid is going to be given, for example, I think some aid is most welcomed. For example, building the elections process, or just the physically, like the boxes, the counters, the sheets, how to print the ballots, how to, this kind of aid is great. But it's extremely important that mediators do not become inadvertently lords through the routing process. And one of the biggest challenges for Libyan democracy is how to make sure that the oligarchs with the old money and the new oligarchs, the routers of the aid, don't skew the democratic process, and that indeed we will have free-thinking citizens, as you say, who will be able to vote in a democratic election.
Mohamed, just the final word before we open it to the audience.
There's not much to add after all of that brilliance, but I will pick up on something Essara said. I mean, very clearly, the brand issue is major. And for organizations, whether the governments like the United States, the UK, the EU, I think a crucial move for them could be to consider building partnerships with countries that are already sending aid to many of these transitioning countries. So when you think about other than Western countries, who's the primary actor in that space? There are actually many Arab countries that are close allies of the United States. So they're natural partners for the United States to work with. Additionally, economically speaking, the United States is not in the strongest position it's been in the past few years, but many of these countries can help in that space. I think we also need to think of aid primarily, of course, as addressing serious poverty, which is a real problem, definitely in Egypt and I think to a lesser degree in Libya. But at the same time, aid for aid's sake just creates more dependency. And unless that aid is going to stimulate job creation and encourage and empower people to provide for themselves, all you're creating is another source of expected money. In Egypt, the expected money was supposed to be coming from the government. If we just take that equation out and just put US aid right in that spot, we haven't accomplished much. So with those 2 points, it's really important. Also, aid is not, I know we're talking about economic aid, but I think technical assistance is really crucial. The point that Dr. Aref made about sort of doing things, especially in transitional justice, in a very local way. Well, the experts at doing that are actually in Africa. They're not in the United States and the UK. The Gacaca courts in Rwanda, with all of the problems that process had, was clearly a transitional justice process that was very closely based on the traditional tribal conflict resolution approaches in that country. The TRC definitely had foreign assistance in its sort of philosophical stage, but the implementation of it was clearly done by national leaders, Desmond Tutu, others. So in terms of assistance, I think technical assistance can actually come on that topic from places that play a totally different role in the political reality of many of these countries than does the US or the UK or Europe.
Okay, great. I think that gives us a lot to talk about. I'd like to open the floor now to the audience to join us in this conversation.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Building on Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, beautiful example yesterday of the rain and the flowers. I do believe that the flowers has to be indigenous flowers. You cannot, bring them from overseas to plant them in Egypt, because he said that the revolution is the rain, and we're looking for democracy and the outcome of it, the flowers to come. I would like to say also based on that example that also he made and the professor I think he made of the birth. I think we can say that freedom or democracy have been conceived but there's no birth yet. It still is pregnant. And the delivery has to be done by local midwives. You know, not to bring a doctor from outside to do the delivery. And I would like just to say that in issue of money, money can help in area of conflict. For example, the Qataris helping Darfur to bring stability to Darfur by offering money for rebuilding Darfur. That kind of aid is helpful in the area where there's conflict and so forth. But the legitimacy of political parties would be in question if they receive money from overseas. And I would like just to end by saying, in America, I promote indigenization of Islam, and Dr. Jackson said the same thing. I would like to say you have to have indigenization of democracy. It has to be indigenous, it cannot be foreign.
Great. I'm going to take two more. We go.
Thank you very much. Peter Mandeville, U.S. Department of State. I want to thank you, Dalia, for pushing this WISE panel to provide advice and input to the U.S. government as we look at these issues. As you rightly say, there is money flowing and it will continue to flow, and we need the input and we need the good ideas. I wanted to provide a little bit of clarification of one issue and then also seek the advice of the panel on another more specific question. I have the impression sometimes that there's an understanding in countries such as Egypt that there are bags of money, bags of US money being handed to particular political parties that the US would like to see do well in elections. And I just want to clarify a little bit about how this money works. You know, there are two sources of money going for democracy and government's activities in Egypt now. One provides direct grants to civil society organizations that do very important capacity building and monitoring work around issues such as human rights and women's rights. These are direct grants that go to local NGOs. The vast majority of the transitional democracy support that the US has been providing, however, takes the form of grants that actually go to American NGOs, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, that then run capacity building seminars and training activities that are open to any party that would like to participate. The US government has no say in which parties take part. We leave that to the discretion of the implementing NGOs. So groups like NDI and IRI have their own criteria by which they determine which parties are committed to the democratic process. That's the sole criterion for their ability to participate in these activities. So if the Freedom and Justice Party and if Hizb an-Nur would like to participate and see value in these programs, then they are welcome to do so. So I just wanted to clarify that point. The issue where I wanted to seek the advice of the panel is the following. Certainly, we were all caught unaware by what happened earlier this year. And the US government went scrambling, digging through our pots of money to find some resources to put towards this important transition that's going on. And it's natural, I think, that we would default into well-worn models of democracy assistance, which, as we all recognize, have their limitations. Going forward, however, we're contemplating new, more ambitious, and I think somewhat more creative mechanisms that, for example, recognize that sometimes US provided democracy assistance, US models, US experiences are not necessarily always the most relevant and the most useful. That recognize that there's tremendous repositories of experience in countries in Latin America, in South Africa, as Mohamed began to kind of allude to in his comments, and that we need to find platform and vehicles to bring those other kinds of expertise to bear on transitions currently underway in Egypt. And so, I'd like to hear from the panel their thoughts on both what kinds of delivery mechanisms, multilateral endowments and foundations for democracy work that perhaps, yes, have some injection of support and financial capital from the United States, but are not by any means US mechanisms, more multilateral in nature. What are better ways of doing this kind of work going forward? Thank you.
European view here for a minute.
My name is Maretta Bilder. I work for the EU in Brussels, and EU is a big thing. I would not pretend to represent it in all its diversity, but just to say that the last discussion has been very interesting for me to listen to, because we, like the US, are thinking about setting up an endowment for democracy. And that is a reflection in Europe, which also has raises some of the questions that was asked here. Are we equipped to do that? Do we know enough? Who are the different political actors? Can we at all do party politics? How do we help the networks that are being built between our civil society and your civil societies? Because I would like to just warn a bit against talking in too aggregated catchphrases, which we often hear in the media. We in fact have lots more contacts with you than what you, or what, at least I got the impression from listening to this discussion. The Venice Commission is a commission of the Council of Europe that does technical support on building constitution. They have been already very, very involved at the request of the Tunisians. And Egypt, even Egypt, where we sense there's a lot of pride, it's much more difficult for some reason to tango with Egypt, there is involvement there. And that's why my second point is, you are right to question the agendas, but look also behind the easy prejudice that we maybe exist on both sides. Look as to why we try to do this. You sometimes, and I hear that often, and that's part of the reason why I'm here, is because Gallup helps me find the ammunition to counter the sort of bias that we find in places like Brussels. But you should also maybe think about how we are not always a unified actor who sits around with, like my US colleague says, bags of money. First of all, we don't have bags of money. Our leadership has a major distraction right now called economic crisis. And that's part of what we see right now, is maybe even not really treating this with the same kind of attention that it needs. But if I were you, I would definitely look at the agenda, but look behind the sort of quick ideas. And it's refreshing to know that that sort of criticism goes beyond just the Western world, for lack of a better term. We have very little street credibility. There should probably be some sort of work going on as to where were we when human rights were needed, and I'm talking in my private capacity. But it's important that that kind of concern do not lead us to throw out baby and bath water at the same time, because there is a lot of goodwill in different places. There's also a bit of reluctance as to how relevant are we? Do we know you well enough to do more harm than to do more help than harm? So if we can have that kind of real discussion based on things, I think that'd be very useful.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn it now to our panel for their reactions to this and final words.
Should I start?
Yes.
Sure. I'd just like to make a comment. I'm sorry, you said you're from the EU? To the EU and the US and any of the foreign parties that are looking at these issues, I think this is one of the things about this moment in the Arab world is that this is everybody gets a second chance. That you do in life sometimes get a second chance. And I think this is a second chance for us in the Arab world to look again within ourselves, first of all, but also for our friends and partners and supporters around the world. And the first thing I think that people around the world should do, especially the United States and the Europeans to some extent, is to study the Gallup polling data really carefully, and all the other data that's all the polling done by so many other people in the region and around the world. People care about respect, they care about justice, and they care about Arab-Israeli issues. And there's no way that any European or American can come to our region and want to be taken seriously when talking about democracy, when they don't apply democratic principles of rule of law, equity, fair treatment to all people, in the case of Arabs and Israelis. And I think this is a really critical issue. It's the credibility, as the great British political philosopher Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones said, it's the singer, not the song. It's the singer, not the song. If the government coming to us wants to be taken seriously and wants us to take them credibly, they need to be credible. And this is hard. I know it's very difficult to do. And the first thing I think that people should do in other countries is not be so hesitant about this Arab awakening and this Arab citizen revolt. Acknowledge it, embrace it, support it unequivocally. The first thing we got in the first 2 or 3 months after January and February from the US and the Europeans was, well, what does this mean for Israel? What does this mean for the Islamists? What does this mean for Iran? We didn't hear people saying, this is a moment of epic, historic heroism for the Arab people. A Rosa Parks moment, a Nelson Mandela moment, a Lech Walesa moment, when spontaneously citizens stood up and achieved their rights as citizens. We didn't hear that. All we heard about is, what does this mean for Israel? What does this mean for Iran? What does this mean for Islamists? And so I think the one point I would make to any foreign group is to simply look at Arab people as having rights in their own right, that we are not hostage to Israeli security concerns, to the narrow electoral concerns of American politicians who want to get elected in Congress, to the strategic interests of Iran or Arab Gulf countries or anybody around the world. To look at people in the Arab world in their own right, as people who have rights, and deal with those issues honestly and openly, and celebrate, support this moment, raising the issues of Arab-Israeli peace, of security, those are fair issues, but they shouldn't be the first issues. They should be the secondary issues. The first issue is to support and acknowledge this historic moment and deal with people on that basis. I think you would get an equally enthusiastic response.
Maybe I wanted to clarify something, that is, we don't have problem with American organization who works in Egypt like IRI and India, but we use, by cutting this organization, to have a pressure for the policymaker, for the US strategy. When we refuse, that is, the policymaker declares some things against, maybe against Egyptians or against or declares, that is, when we ask the US for transparency in everything, we find that they declare, that is, we support the civil society by this money, by the number of this money, but they cannot declare how they support and how much they support the other institutions in Egypt, inside Egypt. They just declare the number of how much they support the civil society, and they refuse to declare the other institutions' aids. And when we say that, we know that is IRI and the NDI make some seminars and working with all the political parties as one, but it's not our problem with them. It's our problem is with the US strategy at all, in general, not with this organization. It's one thing, and the other thing, we ask for transparency in all aids, in all levels, not only with the civil society, but we ask for the civil society transparency, but for all the others aids. Another thing I want to mention is the most important thing now, how we can protect the independence of Egypt's political system by supporting democratic principles, not individuals. I will put underline about these things, 2 or 3 underlines. We stepping down Mubarak, and we find the same strategy with Mubarak again with Tantawi. Until what? Until what we will use the same strategy for the leaders or for individuals. We need to feel that there is a balance when we deal with leaders and deal with the people in the streets. Also, the most important point, the activists students like me, they have opportunity to come here to listen to you, to work with US and know their cultures and how they think. But how we can, the normal people in Egypt, in university, the students in schools, the people who work in different institutions, also exchange knowledge with the citizens here, the civil society here in US or any foreign, to try to be close in culture and to be close in knowledge, to exchange experience. I think it's so important to change the mentality for Egyptian towards the US.
I'm just going to make two very brief comments that are a little bit more along the lines of the questions and not so much on the politics, because I think we definitely have three individuals up here that know that much better than I do. In terms of aid, and this is more of a general topic, but really as a thought I had with our colleague from the EU, if we're talking about aid playing a role in stimulating economies, I think with all due respect, governments are the worst actor that could be picking and choosing economic realities, economic decisions, how jobs are going to be created. I think what's happening in the US is a perfect example of that. US companies, European companies, are the experts at how to engage these countries economically, because they already have for many, many years and very successfully. So if you're at the State Department, if you are in one of the policy agencies of the European Union, if you don't have Coca-Cola and Microsoft and Apple and all of those folks part of the conversation, part of the thinking, I think you're doing yourself a huge disservice. I know that Partnership for New Beginning is attempting to do that. I hope that their accomplishments can be more effectively shared with the masses and quite frankly with a lot of people who consider themselves to be experts on the topic, because it seems very difficult to find information on direct impact of many of these initiatives. Peter, I'm so happy that you made that clarification. As somebody who lives in Washington and meets with people at the State Department for a living, I knew that. The problem is Egyptians have no idea that that's the case. And I think that had Egyptians known that that was the case, you know, the look towards the Salafi groups, the look towards the Muslim Brotherhood would definitely change. And I don't say that because I want to undermine, you know, their image or the way they look. I think that that's part of the transparency that Essara was talking about. I mean, if NDI can buy spots on Dream TV in Egypt of 30 seconds of having a screen that says, these are the organizations that participated in our training, this is when the training occurred, this is the amount of money that was committed to those trainings. If I'm my grandma in Shobra and I turn on TV and I see that the Muslim Brotherhood participated in these trainings, well, the argument that the April 6th movement is a foreign conspiracy now no longer works. The Salafis are not in cahoots with the United States to take over. You know, so people need to know that. The average Egyptian does not know that the entire water treatment system in Cairo was primarily a USAID project.
But it needs media independency.
But what?
It needs media independency.
Well, Egypt needs media independency generally. That's another issue.
A new military one to be the minister now of media.
Let's now turn to Dr. Aref for his final words.
For several months, I was the operations coordinator for something which we called the Libya Stabilization Team. And the idea of this team came up when the British showed up one glorious morning in Benghazi with another 13 countries and wanted to write a stabilization plan for Libya. And I happened to be in Benghazi at the time, discussed it with the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister and the head of the Council. And we decided that, no, we should not have a British-led stabilization team. There should be a Libyan-led effort. And we converted a group of young people who were working for what was called then the support offices into a Libya stabilization team. And we started to look at the literature on stabilization, had very, very fruitful discussions with our British colleagues and benefited greatly from the report that they had written. But then we wrote our own stabilization team. And we did that in full coordination with the UK, the US, the European Union, the UN. And we came up with the idea that it is best to consolidate the aid that various countries wanted to give to Libya via the UN. And I know that there are people who are not very big fans of the UN, but because of the peculiar history of Libya, we were the first creation of the UN in many ways, maybe the only successful story in many ways in country building. Adrian Bell did great work back then, and there is still nostalgia for the UN in Libya. And we were lucky in that the UN chose Ian Martin to coordinate the UN effort. And he's a human rights activist with very long history in transitional justice. And we felt very comfortable working with him. And basically, we try to have a unified assessment. Now, unfortunately, because of the upheavals of the government and we passed through about 2 months of weirdness where things were canceled and then returned. And then when we didn't have clarity, only last Sunday do we have a new transitional government that's able to now take charge of this in a proper manner. This was not a process without difficulties. However, I do still believe that a unified assessment of needs is very important. Rather than having 12 countries or organizations running around doing their own assessments, there should be a countrywide national assessment in which Libyans participate with our international partners. And based on that assessment, there can be aid given and welcomed from all places, provided it is transparent, equally distributed, with equal access to all. Now, the gentleman mentioned, these American NGOs, and the gentleman mentioned American companies. This is no disrespect to such NGOs or companies, but I have a lot of doubt about their ability to be fair, and the criteria you mentioned can be quite subjective. So I think it's best to do it through a national process of assessment. This does run the danger of the government controlling it too much, but you can put into the mechanism participation by civil society. And the point that our colleague Essara makes about access is extremely important. Sometimes aid is pushed and sometimes it's pulled. And most of the time it's a combination of pushing and pulling, or pulling and pushing. But the art of pulling the aid is an intricate art, I discovered. It's actually very complicated. Even your forms and your proposals and the requirements of the proposals, they're so complicated that even someone with a PhD in philosophy and who ran companies, I found it impossible to fill most of those forms. So what I'm trying to say, they end up being filled by somebody in that organization, with somebody they feel comfortable with. And that's typically somebody who's liberal, speaks good English, friendly with foreigners. Okay, so there is already prejudice in the kind of pulling that happens, because people don't go out to the village and speak to the local tribal sheikh or to the local Sufi leader or to the local mosque. Sometimes it does happen, but most of the time it doesn't. It usually happens in the five-star hotel in the downtown of the capital. So what I'm trying to say is, there is a lot of need for creativity in devising ways that are more fair to everyone, that take into account local discrepancies, and that try to consolidate effort rather than just have repetitive efforts that lead nowhere. My advice would be unified assessment, full governmental and civil society participation, with very persistent attempts at breaking any barriers that people may have in participation, so that it really is a fair game for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the main themes that we heard this morning were the importance of seeing this moment in history beyond the three I's: Islamist, Iran, and Israel, the importance of transparency, investment over aid, and working with credible partners, as well as the importance of the indigenous process. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to just give you a quick note of direction. If we could all be back for our working groups to start right at noon. Thank you.
Questions in my head, but I when the fair was over and the angels put to